Slasher movies are timeless. Of all the other subgenres that have spawned from horror, the slasher film has remained universally loved and cherished for much longer than it ever had any business to be. You could probably attribute that to the accessibility of the genre, whether you're consuming it or even creating it for yourself, or maybe just the idea of a seemingly unkillable man who's built like LeBron James who also wants to wear your skin is always going to be scary on some level. Either way, the slasher film has not only endured, it's evolved. It's hard to really nail down exactly what film served as the world's first entry point into the genre, but in terms of the modern day slasher and how we understand it, we can often boil it down to a big three: the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, the Halloween franchise, and the Friday the 13th franchise. It's these properties that establish a rulebook for what defines the prototypical slasher villain: large, male, masked, and most importantly, inhuman. Not in the sense that they can't be killed, even though most of them can't be, but more so that they can't be understood or reasoned with. They're hollow versions of men whose lack of depth is ultimately what makes them scary and fun. It's a reliable formula that, even when done poorly, is still a pretty good time. But what happens when we're given a slasher who's so vulnerable, so genuine, and so human that we almost find ourselves rooting for her? Enter Ty West and Mia Goth's Pearl, a slasher film that breaks all the rules but in the best way possible. Pearl is a blood-soaked melodrama in technicolor that follows a much younger version of the character who we initially met in X, but if you place the two beside one another, you'd hardly believe it. Here, Pearl is disarmingly ethereal. There's a levity about both her and the lush backdrop of the Texas farm that she was raised on that pushes you to forget everything you know about this character, even when the rest of the film is begging you to take a deeper look at who she is. The idea of rooting for a slasher isn't a new concept. At this stage of the genre, we treat the slashers themselves more so as the protagonists than the actual victims. Even so, there's a big difference between rooting for a character and empathizing with them. There's a certain kind of humanity that needs to be present for most audiences to find themselves empathizing with or understanding a slasher. The rules of the genre almost prevent it. West and Goth chose to forego those conventions and instead lean into humanity and complexities of which Pearl has so many. Prior wisdom tells us that every slasher needs a mask. Pearl doesn't. She doesn't have one. And because of that, you might find yourself wanting to believe every little lie that she tells. Not to us, the audience, but to herself. Pearl has dreams. She sings and dances to an audience of barnyard animals in hope that she can one day leave the farm with the intention of being a star. There's a distinct feeling of longing in every frame of this movie as Pearl grapples with a feeling that every audience member has experienced or at the very least can understand. The feeling of unresolved potential. The notion that you are always meant for something more or greater than the life you currently have. A deep urge to seek out the life you were destined for, only to find yourself shackled down by the life that you were given. Pearl, like many of us, is waiting for a miracle. If you pair that with a disabled father, a long-since deployed husband, and a needlessly stern mother, the audience can't help but stand alongside Pearl, wishing and hoping that she's able to find her way off that farm that can initially seem like a prison, but is in actuality a cage. This is by design. Most slasher films involve multiple perspectives, or at the very least two, the killer and the victim, and it's from those perspectives that we experience a movie. But in Pearl, we never leave our killer. She is the sole perspective, and in doing so, every single frame is imbued with a hint of the delusions that she carries. When only one side of the story is seen or told, who's to argue what is and what is not? One of the better examples of this is during a scene in which she's found a batch of nest eggs laid by the closest thing she has to a friend in the form of a fucking alligator, Theta. Initially, she rescues one of the eggs, seemingly in hopes of raising it maybe, only to then crush it in her bare hand. Within every kind of thoughtful gesture she hopes to extend, there is also a peek and sometimes a gaping hole into something cruel that is never too far from the surface. In her essence, Pearl feels most like a girl who's bought into her delusions as a means to run away from herself, and in doing so drifts further and further into who she is. This culminates in a hauntingly long monologue in which Pearl confesses all of her slayings to her sister-in-law, Misty. But as we linger at that table for an uncomfortably long amount of time, we begin to understand that this isn't a confession to Misty or even her husband Howard, of which the conversation is hypothetically framed, but rather to herself. In what's arguably her most human scene, Pearl gives into a moment of pure honesty and self-assessment that we may not have even thought her capable of. It feels like the totality of both the film and who Pearl is, and who she will become, can be seen during this monologue. And what's some of the best writing of any film that I've seen in quite some time, let alone a slasher film, we're able to see both aspects of Pearl. The one that humanizes her, and the one that's a stark reminder of a core that's long since rotted. At her peak, Pearl challenges us to question where we draw the line between evil and unwell. Pearl never wanted any of this to happen. She didn't want to kill these people. She herself even said, "I only want to be loved." All of this is true so long as you're asking her. But in her world, Pearl is the star, and this is her story. And so long as she can cut down anyone who might see otherwise, she can always start it all over again, like an old Hollywood movie. And when you find yourself in the thick of it, surrounded by a technicolor haze, and the hopes and dreams of a girl wishing to be more than what she ever could be, you may not even smell all of the blood that comes along with it.